Very happy to. Well, thank you very much. Real pleasure to see so many people interested in this topic here today. I will be sharing my screen and take us away from that. Perfect. Quick thumbs up, Christian. Can you see the screen? Yeah, okay. Wonderful. So today I was asked to talk about the state of CDR policy in the US and Europe. I'll give a brief background. I know that a lot of you are already familiar with some of and a lot of the concepts, but I'm going to spend a few moments talking about a bit of context, and then I'm really going to go into market and policy in the US and Europe. So hopefully you walk away with a good understanding of the most pressing CDR policies that you should be following. To state the obvious, I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir, these graphs, we're at an all-time high for global atmospheric CO2 concentration. And you probably all know that we cannot achieve net zero without carbon dioxide removal. And again, when we're talking about policy, this is really important because most countries, especially in the global north, have already committed to net zero targets, but have not really installed or passed the appropriate CDR policy to achieve that. So a big lever we have when we talk to governments is the net zero targets and the fact that they will have to pass significant legislation for CDR. And again, CDR, for those less familiar, is obviously what we need to achieve both net zero, but also net neutral thereafter. And this is a graph that you will probably have seen many ways. So I'll just go through it very quickly. And we need to scale the industry significantly. So as per the State of CDR report, we currently have around 2 gigatons of CDR, but of these 2 gigatons, only 2 megatons are actually durable carbon dioxide removal or permanent, which means that if we want to reach the 10 gigatons that we will need annually by 2050, these are all rough numbers. And this would be roughly a growth factor of 5,000. Whether we end up needing 5 gigatons or 10 or 15, I think the takeaway is we need to scale this industry significantly with a compound annual growth rate of anything between 25 and 50%, which for people familiar with exponential growth will understand that that is significant. That's roughly, if not more, the growth that photovoltaics has seen in the last 27 years. So that's the task ahead of us. And in the carbon credits markets, there are 3 types. There's avoidance, reduction, and removal. And it's important to stress that the vast majority right now of the market is avoidance and reduction. The removals market last year was around 230 million out of a total of more than 2 billion. So it's just over 10%, at least last year. But we're seeing a big shift. We're seeing that with you will have followed the Guardian articles and revelations, especially the Kariba project in Zimbabwe. Those have brought a lot of bad press, and I think in many cases, rightly so, right, to avoidance projects in particular. And what we're seeing is a crashing of the carbon credits market as a whole, but a huge pickup and growth in the CDR market. So these are the tons sold. Last year we had 500, again, permanent CDR, we had 593,000. This year we've already passed 4 million and we're projected to reach 7 million, which would be more than 11x growth of CDR purchases this year alone. Deliveries are obviously lagging behind. A lot of these are forward contracts for vintages that might be 2030, even later. But punchline is we're seeing a big pickup, a big growth of the CDR market, despite the slowdown of the carbon credits markets as a whole. 1 second. Now, this is just a simplified overview of the various carbon dioxide removal, of the whole spectrum that we have of carbon dioxide removal. Carbonfuture focuses, and I focus a lot on the durable carbon removal. When I say durable, permanent, industrial, technological, those are all used interchangeably to describe the blue section of the spectrum. We focus particularly on biochar carbon removal at Carbonfuture as by far the most mature, advanced, and scaled durable carbon removal technology. And that's also what I'm happy to talk about more today. But yeah, this is the spectrum that I was talking about when I was talking about these numbers. Biochar, I was told that you already have basic knowledge of biochar, so I won't go into too much detail, but all to say that, yeah, biochar has a lot of co-benefits, is very durable, and is the most affordable permanent CDR. And maybe just some numbers. In 2022, it constituted 87% of all durable CDR deliveries. In the first half of 2023, it was 92% of all permanent CDR deliveries. To give you a comparison, direct air capture was 0.1%. For me, it's always quite interesting how much attention something like I'm all for direct air capture, don't get me wrong. But for me, it's interesting that it gets probably 95% of the attention for 0.1% of the deliveries, whereas biochar, 92% of deliveries and probably 2% of the attention. And another thing I should mention, obviously, I work for Carbonfuture. I should mention this here actually. Carbonfuture is the leading marketplace globally for durable carbon removal credits, more than 40% of the market. We have two products. One is a marketplace, and one is what we call MRV Plus, which is a end-to-end monitoring, reporting, and verification solution for biochar, which allows suppliers to essentially prove that they have truly removed carbon according to third-party standards that we collaborate with an easy end-to-end process. And that obviously makes it much more attractive for buyers, knowing that they've basically been verified through the Carbonfuture MRV. I also wear a second hat. I'm a founding director of the US Biochar Coalition, which is a trade association in the US gathering the voices of the biochar industry. We're primarily focused now on getting biochar into the Farm Bill, which is a once-in-a-decade opportunity for biochar. And we have actually a lot of interesting events coming up. We've got a webinar coming up. We've got a happy hour in DC coming up in the next 2 weeks. So definitely get in touch if you're interested. And I also should say I lead the policy working group of the EBI, the European counterpart of the US Biochar Coalition. So in my day-to-day, I do all durable carbon removal, but I do a lot of biochar. Let's get into policy. In the US, we've got two major laws that have been passed, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Between the two, there's almost, I forgot the exact numbers, but it's like $700 or $800 billion that have been channeled towards the green transition. So these are incredibly large bills that will channel a lot of money to carbon dioxide removal, but as you'll soon see, with a heavy focus on direct air capture. So for example, here we've got from the Inflation Reduction Act, we've got the 45Q tax credit was adjusted, which will bring an approximate of 2.3 billion, but because it's open-ended, it could be much more. It's essentially a tax credit that if you are a DAC producer, you can get $185 of tax credit for every ton of CO2 removed. If you're a BECS producer, you can get 85. Then there's the Regional Direct Air Capture or DAC Hubs program, which is 3.5 billion, of which 1.2 billion were already allocated this year for 2 hubs. But again, it's all focused on direct air capture. There's a couple of other interesting ones I think worth mentioning. These are not, so the CDR, I'll talk about the Farm Bill in more detail in a second, but the CDRLA or Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act is a really incredible piece of legislation that will see the public procurement of significant amounts of CDR by the federal government. However, this is a partisan piece of legislation, so frankly, in this current government, it doesn't just stand a chance. But we're seeing states, New York and Massachusetts in particular, passing state-level CDRLAs. So this has kind of created a footprint that has been adopted at state level, and it's tech agnostic. So it would, biochar can also qualify for it. Then there's the CREST Act, which is very interesting because it's bipartisan. The CREST Act also had a public procurement piece, but that's probably not going to make it. So it focuses a lot on R&D and innovation funding, but again, across carbon removal technologies. And this is one that we could definitely see passing. Now, the Farm Bill is probably the most exciting one that I would recommend following for biochar. The Farm Bill is every 5 years. The last one was around $450 billion. And it's basically it provides the budget of the USDA, the Agriculture Department of the United States. The next two farm bills are supposed to be around 1.5 trillion. So we're seeing a big increase in the budget of the Farm Bill. And this is really where a lot of exciting things come in. For example, just to mention one, conservation practice. If biochar can be recognized as an eligible conservation practice for farmers, then suddenly hundreds of millions or billions of dollars could flow to biochar through the Farm Bill vehicle. So the Farm Bill is really an outstanding piece of legislation for any kind of nature-based solutions and also enhanced rock weathering and biochar. So a lot of our focus right now is on the Farm Bill. And I should have said this should have been passed this year, but because of government shutdowns and everything else, it's going to move into next year. The final one in the US is the DOE, Department of Energy, is kind of the implementing body of a lot of the funding that I've been discussing. And they've announced a 35 million essentially procurement pilot, which is really unique because it's the first time a government has actually done public procurement across CDR technologies. You can see that bikers, biomass with carbon removal and storage qualifies, although it's not very clear if that includes biochar according to the DOE definitions. But it's small, but it's an exciting first step. And depending on how the elections go in 2 years, next year, wow. And that could have a major upgrade or be axed. Unfortunately, the US, unlike Europe, is very prone to political swings, and the Department of Carbon Management, the Office of Carbon Management of the DOE, which manages CDR, is a very partisan issue. When you have with Trump in government, it will focus just on fossil fuels. With Biden in government, it focuses on CDR. So we really have to see how the election goes. Switching to EU policy. EU policy is characterized by what's called the European Green Deal. The Green Deal is the roadmap for Europe to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. There's also an interim target of 55% reduction by 2030. And as you can see, the Green Deal includes a lot of different aspects. Now, there's three important vehicles to achieve net zero. One is the emission trading. There's a spelling mistake here. It's not the emission tradition system, it's the emission trading system. The other one is the EU emission sharing regulation. And then the last one is the land use change, and forestry. Between these three, you basically cover 100% of EU emissions. And what we need to do now, and again, I can dive into all of these later if you're interested, but what we need to do is to include CDR in these three, which have been around for a while and do not currently include CDR. Only LULUCF has some, natural sinks CDR, but the other ESI and ETS don't have any CDR in it. And the way that the European Union works is, the US is just throwing money at CDR. There's not a lot of talk about definitions, about standards, about certification. It's just like, let's get boots on the ground, let's get steel in the ground, which is admirable, but it also means that it's not as methodical, and it's focused heavily on who's loudest, which in this case was direct air capture. The EU is much more kind of planned and meticulous, I would say, to some extent, which in this case means, okay, we've got these three vehicles. We need to include CDR in it. So let's work on the missing building block that we need to then slot CDR into all these different things. The missing building block here, and I'll talk about the four more relevant policies for CDR, is the CRCF. And I'll talk about it a little bit more in a second, so I'll just skip over it. Also worth talking about are the climate targets, the Green Claims Directive, and the emission trading system. The climate targets will set CDR specific targets, hopefully, for 2040, which would be huge, which would immediately apply to all 27 member states. They will be released as draft early next year. The Green Claims Directive mandates how corporates can make carbon or net zero claims. And again, this will see a big drive towards lower risk credits and offsets, which should see a surge for CDR. And the reform of the ETS would see the inclusion of CDR after 2030. To give you an idea, the ETS is 760 billion euros a year. I mean, if CDR were included here, basically all heavy polluting industries in Europe would have to start procuring CDR. So this type of compliance mechanism could be a huge boost for CDR. Quickly on the CRCF, the CRCF focuses on the certification. Basically, what does high quality carbon removal look like? It focuses on three categories: products, carbon farming, and permanent carbon storage. Obviously, what I'm focused on most and where we're trying to get biochar included is permanent carbon storage. And whatever is going to make it into the CRCF, permanent carbon storage, will have a huge boost across European climate policy. I don't have time to go into detail now on CRCF, but it's a very hot topic. So if you have questions about it, I can go into all the details about where it stands, where it's heading, and so on. I spoke about the emission trading system. About targets, yeah, right now, we only have kind of a non-binding target of 5 megatons by 2030. That is nothing. So we really need proper CDR targets. And again, early next year, we'll hopefully see the first proposal by the Commission on this. And I've spoken about the Green Claims Directive, which again, we should see a lot of boost for CDR as a result. If you're interested, you can find this on the Carbonfuture magazine. I've actually done an analysis of all the EU states and their respective CDR policies. So if you're interested, there's a lot more analysis. We've also done the same for the US, looking at all 50 US states and their CDR policy. So just go on the Carbonfuture website, go on the magazine, and you'll see this. There's also other interesting stuff like deep dive on ETS integration. There's a lot of good stuff. And the final thing is for people to be aware is the Innovation Fund. The Innovation Fund is basically where revenue from the ETS are being channeled into the green transition. And there's a lot of calls for applications, and this increasingly includes CDR. So, for example, Stockholm Exergi, a big BEX company in Sweden, has received several hundred millions of euros from the Innovation Fund. But yeah, that was a quick run through. I know this was quite rapid fire, but I wanted to make sure that we have at least 10 minutes for questions. And I hope this was useful, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for this very quick shooting of policies to the audience. So if you have any questions, please write into the chat or unmute yourself and ask the question directly. So I have one question to the CRCF, because I think that was not in the media, in the social media maybe, about about the definition of permanence and the exclusion of biochar, or one of the votes. So what's your thought on that? Because we see that a lot, that the biochar is not really seen as permanent from some actors, although the 100-year timeline is basically more or less certain, but then not 10,000 years. So what's your view? Why is this such a big thing that people focus on 10,000 years timelines for permanence instead of 100, for example?
Yeah, so permanence is obviously defined in various ways in different bodies. Usually it's 1,000 years. In the CRCF, it's actually, the definition is several centuries. But the reason that what you're referring to is the EU Parliament took a stand, not against biochar, but against pretty much anything that isn't BECCS and DUCs with geological storage, is that they were just playing their cards safe. DUCs and BECCS is pretty well regulated in the EU through the CCS directive from 2005, which was made for CCS, not for CDR, but it applies to geological storage. And so they just played it safe, which led to a very limited, restricted definition, which excludes biochar enhanced rock weathering, ocean alkalinity enhancement, everything else. For people who understand European politics less, there's three bodies. There's the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. They all form independently their position, and then they go into what's called a trilogue and bash it out until they have found an agreement. This is basically, we're going to see the vote of the European Parliament on the 20th of November, which is likely not going to be positive for biochar, but it's just one of three institutions. The Commission is heavily in favor of biochar, and anyone who witnessed last week's workshop on industrial removals will have witnessed that. And the Council is neutral to positive on biochar. So I'm pretty confident that in the trilogue, the European Parliament's position will not prevail. And maybe just one note on permanence. I mean, people who have seen it, otherwise watch it. It's really worthwhile watching Hamed Zaneh from the University of Aarhus present on biochar permanence. It's a completely new strand of thinking and science on biochar permanence, which is very different to what's been done for the last 15 to 20 years. And I think it's fair enough that people require a bit of time and also more evidence until they adjust to what is frankly a very different type of talking about biochar permanence. So expect the tides will turn, but it might take another 6, 12, 18 months until everyone's on board.
And a follow-up question just from the chat. Why do you think is the parliament negative towards biochar? So was the more CCS focus on the lobbying level, or?
So there is a couple of things. First, they weren't against biochar. They were against anything that wasn't BECCS and DACCS with geological storage. Why? Because they wanted to, the parliament often sees its role as having kind of a very rigorous position. And in this case, they interpreted rigorous as let's play the most narrow definition possible. Having said that, there are voices in the Environment Committee, the lead committee here, especially from the Green Party at European level, which are firing heavily against biochar. And there's a lot of concern about and misunderstandings about anything that involves biomass. So the simplified version is you're using biomass, you're going to chop down all our beautiful forests. That's kind of the simplified view how people think about biochar, right? They don't understand the concept of like cascading use of biomass, of waste biomass, of RED 3 directive, right? And so it's very simplified, like I'm a Green Party politician, it's touching biomass, they're going to cut down our beautiful nature. So there's definitely that as well, and that is a voice that is not to be underestimated in the parliament.
And then a question, a bit change of a topic, but I think it's quite fitting. So Hanne was asking, to reach the CDR goal, is it up to Europe and the US, or is there also a good progression expected in South America, Australia, Africa, I guess Asia?
So this is really absurd, right? Because the climate doesn't care where we do CDR, but politics cares, taxpayers care. And so it's unfortunately, goals are made nationally or regionally, and goals have to be achieved nationally or regionally. We create these artificial walls around us. So it does mean that the European targets, for example, will have to be achieved with European CDR. Maybe in future, if the UN Article 6 process moves well, we'll see exceptions. For example, Switzerland has a CDR target and has even defined how much of its target they will procure from abroad. But that is really an exception, not the norm. Because, yeah, I mean, my take is I'm pushing hard in my work to break down these walls because the environment to do CDR is often so much more conducive. Biochar is a good example in the global south than the global north. So we should absolutely do it, but politically, unfortunately, it's a bit hard.
And coming back to the walls, probably a bit. So for the US public procurement that was planned of the direct procurement of CDR, what would be the methodology for the government that they follow to buy a CDR credit in the US with public money? Is there a standard they would follow, or what definition would they use? Or is there anything in writing or?
Yes, I will, and I'm happy to kind of post also after we finish the Q&A. I posted kind of the CSEF link already here, but there is there's specific criteria that they use. So it differs for each methodology. You might have seen there's 4 buckets: bikers, direct air capture, mineralization, and so on. And they have a specific methodology. The DOE has a view of biochar that it's not permanent. It's something we need to work on. So my fear is that biochar will have a tough time to qualify under this public procurement pilot. I think biochar has much more potential under the Farm Bill than under the DOE work right now. But obviously, again, these things change rather quickly in the US.
And then Shachik, I always pronounce it wrong. Do you have any thoughts on the very small recognition of biochar use in the US RCPP 23 project announced earlier this week? I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
If whoever asked the question want to elaborate how it's kind of been overlooked, then maybe I can answer. But yeah, like this, it's not specific enough.
And so write your questions because we only have 3 minutes left for this presentation. So I have a general question that I always wanted to ask. So because the EU ETS is the big compliance market, and the voluntary carbon market is somehow the small innovative brother. What is your view? How will these two act together in the future? Will that how is this relationship going to get in the next couple of years?
Yeah. So what's happening? So just on the surface, the ETS won't change until 2030. That's already set. So the earliest the ETS will change and potentially include CDR is 2031. The Commission has to put together a proposal by 2026 on what CDR ETS integration could look like. And now it's currently in the knowledge gathering phase for that. Basically, and again, I'll post the analysis I've done on the ETS integration, but broadly, there are kind of three things that we would like to see or that we could see. One is we could see a dedicated emission removal system parallel to the ETS just for removals. That would be the best case for removals. That's highly unlikely. The second case is we have an intermediary, often talked like, for example, a carbon central bank. It could be a government institution that manages the supply and cost and volume of CDR into the ETS. That's kind of what I think is currently in the literature, the preferred setup of how it could be. And then I guess the third question is what CDR should be included. Our recommendation, what I think will happen is it should be tightly linked to the CRCF permanent category, right? So only what qualifies as permanent carbon storage under the CRCF should be used in the ETS. There are some people who are pushing for afforestation to be included in the ETS. I don't think that's going to happen, at least not in the early stages. So we will really only see, I guess, the highest trust CDR from the CRCF being included in the ETS.